Today on the Cameron Journal podcast, I am here with Jim Bowers, and we are going to be taking a trip back to the 1960s with a 1960s Bob Dylan affiliated rocker who, to be very honest with you, I have never heard of. My mom might know who this guy is, but I don't, because I am a sad millennial that was born in the 80s. But all this means is a learning opportunity for me and all of us. This guy has kind of a tragic story. Looks like he kind of took his own life. Didn't quite make the 27 club, but had sounds like some personal issues. Anyway, we have someone who knows all about this. He's written a new book about Phil Ochs. So welcome, Jim, to the Cameron Journal podcast.
Thank you for having me, Cameron. I like what you're doing. I've taken a look at your podcasts and things and you're doing some good journalism out there.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. That's what we aim to do. And this is one of my favorite things to do is to have great conversations with people on interesting subjects. And this is something where I think I was just so intrigued by the idea of the project. I'm like, yes, we should definitely, have this conversation. So, why don't we start from the beginning, and why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to write about this guy's life?
Okay. Well, actually, your opening set me up nicely for that because you admitted you didn't know anything about him, but you also kind of led with putting him in relationship to Bob Dylan. And that was one of Phil's crosses, if not curse, that he had to kind of bear when he was performing. Phil, like other people like Dylan, Judy Collins, Eric Anderson, Tom Paxson, they all came out of the kind of the Greenwich Village 1960s folk scene. Okay.
Right.
Phil, though, was a very much a topical songwriter. He didn't like to call himself a protest songwriter, but it was topical. His songs came out of the news, came out of the headlines, and in very much in kind of a folk, certain aspects of folk tradition, like a Woody Guthrie, he wrote about the issues of the day. The thing was, Dylan was better at PR. Dylan was in the right places at the right time, and Phil was always in Dylan's shadows. And one of the things I talk about in the book, and I know I'm getting ahead of the game, but I'll back up here in a second because it fits, is he had this really kind of tragic relationship with Dylan. Always wanted Dylan's respect, always wanted Dylan's love, always wanted to defend Dylan, and Dylan would give almost nothing in return. And a whole nother book there. But anyway, let me back up a little bit. How did I get into him?
Didn't Joan Baez say the
Interestingly
same
enough,
thing? Anyway.
Joan Baez said that yes, there was a tension between her and her and Dylan after their relationship broke up. But let me back up. I am a child of the late 60s, early 70s, but I grew up in rural Illinois, small town Illinois. You didn't hear Phil Ochs' music on the 1 a.m. radio station we had back then. I didn't really know much about Phil Ochs until I started teaching a course a number of years ago at the college that I was at the time on music and politics. And I was teaching Guthrie, I was teaching some Dylan, I was even teaching like NWA and Public Enemy, the politically oriented hip hop. But Phil's name kept popping up. It kept popping up. And so I'd look a little bit more, find out a little bit more, started reading a little bit more. And one day I had the epiphany that this was the man everybody thought Bob Dylan was in the 60s. Because Phil lived the movements. Phil wrote the movement. Phil wrote the soundtrack of the anti-war movement, the 1960s Vietnam War, movement. It wasn't Dylan. It was Phil. But he paid the price for that. And so it was that epiphany that got me really wanting to kind of look into him. And then I went, now I'm up here in Western New York, Rochester, New York. I'm Googling one day and I run across this name, Sonny Ochs. It's like, who the hell is Sonny Ochs? I knew Phil had a daughter. I knew he had a brother. I hadn't heard of his sister, his older sister, who lived 3.5 hours away from me. So I call her up, introduce myself, ask her if I could come and talk to her. And I can tell you now, Sonny Ochs is a force of nature in her own right. And she has helped keep Phil's legacy and music alive for years, introducing it to younger generations of folk music performers. And by the time I got done talking with Sonny, I knew I had to do something about her brother. I had to do some kind of project to kind of help restore his legacy and to get people to understand he was far more than just a second banana to Dylan and to others. I'm sorry for that long rambling question, but that's somehow it's hard to give short answers here on some of this.
No, no, that's very helpful because you've brought us up to speed on what it is and who he was and all this type of thing. So yes, so I've given shades of it, but why don't you give the broad arc of, I guess kind of what happened and what you cover in the book.
Okay, well, let's start then with the book's title. The title is That Man in the Gold Lamé Suit. The subtitle is Phil Ochs' Search for Self. And the book takes a psychological approach to understanding who Phil was. So, in that regard, it's not a traditional biography. I don't worry about where he went to high school. I don't worry about what sports he played, et cetera, et cetera. Uh, and so, it's more in the realm of what you would call a psychobiography. And Phil himself, his story is one that really is about finding out who he was and using quite often the art and his music as a way of projecting who he was, but also protecting himself from who he was. So, Phil, and I don't want this to sound trite or cliche, we all search for who we are. We all have a search for self. It's more an issue about how it manifests itself. Does it manifest itself in healthy behavior? Does it manifest itself in a secure identity? Well, in Phil's, it didn't. In part, for example, because he had a very distant mother who had been born in kind of a upper middle class Scottish family, thought children were basically a social burden that she had to bear, literally. His father was a physician who after World War II was diagnosed back then as a manic depressive. Today, that's often called bipolar. So he was emotionally absent, sometimes actually absent from the home when he was in the hospitals. Phil's mother's approach to mothering was criticizing. So Phil had very little affirmation growing up, and he sought venues to be affirmed. So let me pause there in case you have something you want to ask, or I'll keep going.
No, 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 no. No, I was so I had something urgent happening and I needed to tell someone I was busy.
Oh, oh,
Um
no, 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 that wasn't a problem. I wasn't even looking directly at you. I just didn't want to go on and on. So let me pick the story. So if
yeah, no, 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 the only thing I was going to say was that without emotionally distant parents and absent fathers, you would have no music and art in this country. Um and I
no,
was
that's a good point actually.
and I was saying that in reference to myself, and I was thinking that I have a lot of common with this Mr. Oaks person. Um, so it yes, so that was all
Oh,
I was thinking.
oh, no, actually, Cameron, that's a good response because there are sections in the book that looks at the role of music for the artist and how the artist and Phil in particular, not only could he create something that would be part of himself, his songs, but in creating the songs, they were also something separate from him. And it's that combined process that, like a lot of artists, you get affirmation for your work, whether it's writing, acting, comedy, whatever. Frankly, in my case, it was music and teaching. Okay. So it's not that Phil was any different than most artists. It was simply how that struggle as an artist that so many artists go through, why it came about, and how did he react. So, for example, Phil had two near death experiences as a young child. One clearly you could see unconsciously being assigned to his mother's behavior. his mother, being very self-centered, decided in winter time to take the children back home to Scotland. So they're going across the Atlantic in like February, and the deck is all icy. And Phil pretty much almost goes overboard. He slips on the ice. They're out playing. Last minute, he grabs hold of something. It's kind of unclear what he grabbed hold of. And the symbolism in a child's mind was the only reason he was alive is because he saved himself. His mother put him at risk.
Yeah.
There was an apartment fire later on that Phil kind of started that he escaped from. So Phil has his interesting story of where the neglect by his mother, and by the way, I want to be careful here, because parents don't most parents don't intentionally neglect. They do the best they can with the tools they have. So one of her tools was to drop Phil and his brother Michael off at the movie theater anytime that um, she wanted to get rid of the kids. And Phil spent an enormous part of his childhood in the darkened theaters. And in the darkened theaters, he found not only a safe place, but on the silver screen, he found heroes, particularly Western heroes. John Wayne, in particular, Audie Murphy, but particularly John Wayne. And those became replaced father and other and parental figures. They became his, what we call in self-psychology, idealized self-objects. He could seek affirmation by trying to be like them. And so one of the themes that comes out in Phil's life, even in his music, one of the reasons he was so topical in his writing, where Dylan became more poetic / abstract, was Phil wanted to be like the heroes on the silver screen that he saw. He wanted to be heroic. He wanted to be heroic, be seen as heroic. Boom. You become the voice of you become the musical voice of the anti-war movement. He leads marches. He becomes a political activist. Okay. See what I'm getting at? I'm sorry I can't put this in a real nutshells.
No, 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 no.
But
Yeah,
these
no, it's
kind of
fine.
themes, these kind of themes play out. One of the dominant themes in Phil Ochs' search for self was the need to be heroic. That all comes back to the need to being affirmed. You can see it play out in other ways. The lack of a strong family connection, Phil was generally unable to maintain close personal relationships. Okay. Because when he would get involved with a woman, he would expect the woman to basically care for him. And when she failed to care for him in the way that he thought she should, he felt rejected. There's one story, which isn't original in my research, but it was very telling, that one of the relationships he was in, this was a woman who apparently really submerged her personality for Phil, but one night forgot to pick him up at the airport after a show, and it took him into a blue drunken rage. She wasn't treating him the way she thought so. When he was married, he thought he should be able to still go off and do all the things he wanted to do. Phil could barely maintain a close, intimate relationship, but his need for affirmation at the same time required him to be around people as much as possible. Okay.
I
Intimately.
know that Faustian bargain very well.
Okay. Okay.
Well,
You're
no,
free to
as
elaborate if you'd
no,
like.
no,
It's
as
your
someone, no, no,
show.
no, no. As someone who grew up with a dis my so my people are Colorado Plains people. And as I told my ex-girlfriend at one point, there's not a lot of time for emotions when the dust storm is coming. And I come from those sorts of people. Um And and there's not a lot of time for emotion when you're depending on the land to provide for your living. And by the way, it doesn't rain that often in Eastern Colorado, so you're grateful for every drop. Um and so compared to a lot of, so I didn't miss, so I come from people who tend to not have a ton of emotion, and I will have a 20-minute conversation with my aunt about water, which I live in the East now, and people are kind of like, you're talking about water, why? I'm like, in the
because
West
we
it's
didn't have it.
dry, it is a hot topic of conversation. When I call my family, I'm like, yes, we will spend 10 minutes talking about water. Has it rained? Has it snowed? So these are the people I come from. And so, for me at a personal level, um, it took me a great many years, and it doesn't sound like Phil ever figured this out. It took me a great many years to realize that when you have m many generations of people who are not terribly emotional, and then a child gets born who needs a lot of emotional feedback
Mm-hmm.
and affirming and all this type of thing. That child's not going to get what they need emotionally, and it's going to affect them at a very, very deep level.
Ex-
And so you end up having to find a way to provide that for yourself. You will never find it in a romantic relationship. You will never find it even, in friends or in a crowd. And I'm the type of person, I'm probably more comfortable on stage in front of 5,000 people than I am in this conversation right now, sort of thing. None of that really ever fixes that
ex-
sort of thing. And you damage and hurt a lot of people on your journey to figuring
ex-
that out.
by the way, you're describing the book. You're doing a great job yourself describing the book, because
Yeah.
again, that's what this is about. Is yeah, Phil didn't intend to be the way he was. We're the product of the relationships we have with others, and particularly at a young age, how those relationships affect us. So uh, I'm sure you did it. I know I did it. Phil clearly did it. In those places where our unconscious picks up on inadequacies, we try to correct those inadequacies. So in Phil's case, the heroes on the silver screen. Okay. In intimate relationships, Phil had a deep attachment to prostitutes because you could pretend. In fact, one of his most beautiful songs, and a song that I can't listen to the same way now that I've done the research, is a song called "The Pleasures of the Harbor." And in Pleasures of the Harbor, the story is basically of a sailor on shore leave who goes to visit a prostitute, and the temporary nature of it and all of this. But if you would listen to the song, and once you understand Phil's own issues with intimacy, with intimate relationships, even among friends, I think in some ways, you realize that he's really writing about himself, that he is the sailor, that he's quite aware in that moment that he's writing this song of kind of the fraud he's perpetuating upon himself, but yet the necessity of that fraud. You know, you and the same way on
Yeah.
stage, he was at his best on stage. Phil was well known for letting anybody who wanted to come backstage, and he'd talk to him for hours. Yeah,
No, I mean,
but
I think that, I think that's one of those things, God, it's like, and this, it sounds like this is true for him. It certainly was true for me. If you don't have that, like if you have that sort of wound, that's just kind of your burden to bear this lifetime. Like, I don't think there's a lot of ballyhooing about trying to heal that sort of thing, or trying to, fix that and all this type of thing. And I have not seen positive evidence of that yet.
right.
That's
Well,
another
let's.
show, but
Well, you're raising good points, and this is the thing I find interesting about this book. I mean, it's clearly about Phil's story, but the method that's employed, the theory of self psychology, allows the reader to also begin to see themselves, maybe not in Phil's exact stories, but oh, yeah. I have felt this way. Oh, yeah, I remember this from my childhood. I've had a number of people who told me that as they've read this book about Phil, that they began to find themselves quietly kind of contemplating their own childhood, their own issues. And I know, for example, I did this. I don't hide things. I'm a firm believer in therapy, and a good portion of what I struggled with in understanding Phil, I worked out in some of my own therapy sessions because I had, as in this kind of research, you have to be able to merge yourself into the subject's personality and recognize I can't sit down and talk to him. You know, this type of work, you're basically trying to get a dead guy to talk to you. A little
Right.
hard to do. So you merge yourself into anything he said, anything he wrote, looking for clues, looking for pieces, waiting for him to reveal himself. What I had to do, and what any good psychohistorian, psychobiographer does, you have to learn how to merge yourself into that person's personality while keeping your own self out of it. And I know I had a number of sessions with my therapist trying to make certain that what I was talking about was what I understood Phil saying versus how I was feeling. So it's kind of like I jokingly have told people it's kind of like in the old Star Trek, Spock and his Vulcan mind melt. This is kind of like a Vulcan mind melt. But anyway, sorry if I'm not being as linear as I taught this way too. I'm not a linear person. But to come back to the themes, though, you would see this though, this particularly this need for heroicism, this need for affirmation, acceptance, embrace, play out also in his politics. Besides being that voice in the anti-war movement, Phil got his image of America also largely from those Western movies he used to watch growing up and other movies, the values in them. Okay. The very traditional American dream type of values. And most of Phil's politics was driven by what he saw was the need to save the current America from the people like Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, the war, and to restore it to what it could be. Okay. And so he thought in terms of America in heroic values as well. Okay. And as and that's defined much of what Phil's politics was. I'll give you an example. It's easy to think of Phil as anti-war. Phil was not anti-war. He was anti an unheroic war, a war that did not have a clear purpose, a war that did not bestow the best of America. That's different from most of your 1960s radicals.
True.
Heroism. His trouble with Bob Dylan. Your comment earlier about you won't resolve these problems through friends, et cetera, et cetera. Perfect example. But unlike what you and I can go through, if we choose to, the nature of the times, you didn't go to therapy.
Well, I hadn't said that when I said that before, but I said, it's, and I was thinking that, even, with modern, my point of that by saying was even with modern therapy, that's a very hard thing to heal. And those things weren't even resources available at the time. A lot of the family systems work, family systems therapy, mother wound, father wound stuff wouldn't come out to the 80s. And a lot of that was because you had, a couple generations of people who had, dealt with parents who were alcoholics and how that had caused family issues. And that then caused people to start to get into family systems research. And that's where family systems therapy comes from. And a lot of that came out of the adult children of alcoholics movement of the late
Hmm.
70s, because the greatest generation and the silent generation liked to drink. And it really had an ad effect on boomers and early Gen X.
Oh yeah.
And dealing with the fact that, that, so many people were, functional or sometimes barely functional or sometimes not at all functional alcoholics, and how that affected children, and that, so, yeah, if he'd hung on for about another decade, um and made that transition, as many of the stars of his day did, from the outward, we're trying to change the world, to the inward, we're going to meditate on a beach in California thing, looking at you, Jane Fonda, looking at you, many other sort of thing. Then he probably would have ended up, at an ashram, head shaved, robe on,
Who knows? I have yeah,
meditating sort of thing.
yeah. Who knows? But actually, to kind of make this a my end, bring it to some kind of at least story setup closure, I guess.
Yeah.
Man, the title, that man in the gold lame suit. You understand? There's a reason I went that with that title. In our search for self, we're ultimately trying to integrate the various aspects of who we are into something coherent and whole, rather than having a feeling of falling apart. Okay. So Phil was your kind of traditional topical songwriter in the early 60s. But as Dylan went kind of abstract, he began to play with abstract. Some of his music was very, very good. Some of it was okay. Some of it seemed a bit of a caricature. But and I realize I'm doing kind of maybe ancient history for some of your listening, but a real psychological break for Phil, not break as in break out, but a breakdown, occurred at the end of 1968, when all his hopes for the American dream and the anti-war movement came crashing down in the streets of Chicago in the 1968 Chicago Convention, the election of Richard Nixon. He took it personal. He took it very personal. His albums weren't selling as well. He actually, in 69, did a record called Rehearsals for Retirement, where there is a tombstone on the album cover that says Phil Ochs, born 1940, El Paso, Texas, died August 1968, Chicago. Okay. He felt himself fragmenting. He thought he might have to leave he was thinking he might have to leave the country. He couldn't see himself as an American anymore, which means he couldn't see himself as a hero anymore. But then he turned it around. And in late 69, 70, Phil had his own epiphany. And this is going to sound funny, but he said, basically got to thinking, if there's any hope for revolution in America, it's for Elvis Presley to become Che Guevara, okay, the Cuban revolutionary. Realizing Elvis wouldn't. And what he meant by that is he thought Elvis's music was the music of the people. That was another one of his heroes, was Elvis. And he wanted Elvis size fame. That's something I have kind of left out. He wanted Elvis size fame. He wanted Dylan's size fame because it would make him feel more whole. He knew, obviously, Elvis is not going to, record that kind of music. So he decided, there's two parts of it. One, you needed someone like Elvis. Two, one of the failings of the counterculture in the 60s was that the counterculture and the radicals of the 60s, they alienated the working class. Whereas the old Woody Guthrie types, the old Pete Seeger types, frankly, the communist types at times,
Right.
they embraced the working. So Phil decided he was going to try to do that. He went from doing abstract music, he went from doing protest music, to basically being one of the early pioneers, are you ready for this? Of California country rock. He decided he wanted to be the folk version of Merle Haggard. and he recorded a whole album called Greatest Hits, which was a parody because he had no hits. But all the songs on it have some kind of country influence, have some kind of Bakersfield sound influence on them, even to where he's using some of Merle Haggard's people, some of Buck Owens's people on the album. Okay. He then has this gold suit made, an exact replica of a gold lame suit that Elvis once wore. And he went on tour wearing it, backed up by a rock and roll band. Now imagine if you're used to going to Carnegie Hall and seeing Phil Ochs with just a solo guitar in a really bad looking sport coat and a tie. The shock you must have had as his fan. It was all rejected.
Yeah.
The critics rejected it, the fans rejected it, but it was the last thing that Phil Ochs believed in. He thought, I found this great quote. Someone asked him at the night of the Carnegie Hall concert in New York, which really where this bombed, at least by a lot of accounts. Well, Phil, you announced your retirement in your last album, rehearsals for retirement. Why are you doing this? Quote, I got tired of being dead. Someone after this, even when all this fell apart, someone asked him about it. He says, no, that time and those nights at Carnegie Hall were some of the best nights of my life because, quote, it was the first time I put it all together. Meaning not just the music, it was the first time that Phil Ochs felt that he was whole. When that was rejected, you mentioned in the intro about his eventual suicide, he went this way, intense writer's block. Ultimately takes on a alternate ego called John Train, where finally the rage can come out. Let me pause there because I'm rambling. But anyway, so there's a reason for this because that man in the gold lame suit, that short period of time in Phil's life, which might have been 6 months, was the linchpin to him finding who he was. And when it got rejected, he couldn't sustain it. He couldn't deal with the rejection. And he went back to being the old Phil Ochs that people and his fans expected him to be. And he was never happy after that.
No, I think one of the big regrets that I do not have because I have a very bad habit. I only know how to be myself. But I see many uh kind of well-placed people, talking about is you have to be very careful what you become famous for because once that happens for you, that's what people expect, sort of thing. So you better like it, you better love it, it better be authentic to you, all this type of thing. If you try to create something out of a conceit, and then you want to, presuming you want to make money off of that and do that for your job, you're going to be stuck having to be that person. And some people can do it very well, you know. I think Dolly Parton loves being Dolly Parton and she loves the persona she's created for herself. But I think because she created it herself and it's what she loves, it works. If you create something just for the fame, the applause, or whatever have you, but it's not really who you are, it will be a burden.
Well, and on that, in Phil's case, no, your observations are spot on. In Phil's case, Phil never started out to create a persona. Frankly, I think Dylan did. But again, I'm not a Dylan expert. Phil always was putting himself out there, even when he didn't know exactly who his self was. Okay.
Right. Yeah.
But what Phil found, particularly after the being that man in the Gold Lamé suit, being what I call Elvis Shea, Phil's fans wouldn't let him grow. He didn't think they would. He they wanted they wanted him to do the old songs. They wanted him to become kind of like a folk oldies act. And since that wasn't an intentional persona like Dolly or here, Mickey Dolenz, the last remaining monkeys.
Yeah.
Mickey Dolenz has been happy being Mickey Dolenz since the Monkees.
Right.
And he'll play
Yeah.
all the songs. He doesn't try to be more, you know, sorry to you. I mean, that's one example that comes to mind. He's almost 80 years
Yeah.
old and he's still singing "I'm a Believer." Okay,
Oh, no, there's summer concert series are littered with people who are in
right,
exactly the
right.
same boat. And I think it's very hard for artists because a lot of times fans really won't let you grow and then it becomes a terrible burden, you know.
And in Phil's case, like I said, where I think someone like a Mickey Dolenz or your example, Dolly Parton, are happy being a caricature that they've created. Phil never meant to create any caricature of himself.
Right.
And again, it's hard to kind of explain this. In fact, Frank, I really appreciate the time you're taking because it's hard to explain this book in some ways because we're chronicling, we're laying out a man's intimate search for himself with all its high points and all its low points. When he hit that stage in that gold suit, he knew he was doing a bit of a parody, but he was putting together his love of early rock and roll, his love of country, his love of folk, blending them all together to try to also recapture his heroic nature they had during the anti-war movement. And it all came crashing down because the people, in part because he himself wasn't secure enough to say, basically, screw you, this is who I am now,
Right.
and the fans' own rejection. His drinking increased after that. Like I said, intense writer's block. Um, and what he in effect did in this last part, you know, in self psychology, the idea is that we're always trying to build who we are. We're always trying to put the pieces together. In this last incarnation of who he was, when he became this John Train figure, John Train was the complete antithesis of Phil Ochs. Phil was actually a gentle soul, funny soul, loved people because he needed their love. John Train was the exact opposite. I mean, it was a Jekyll Hyde kind of thing.
Yeah.
John Train could engage in all the rage that Phil Ochs couldn't. And one of the targets for that rage was Bob Dylan, where again, I don't, he was, now remember, oh, by the way, I left some out. Phil Ochs, by his ethnicity, was Jewish, but the family never practiced. Bob Dylan, Jewish. In one of his rages as John Train, he denounced basically Bob Dylan as that cheap little Jew. I mean, it was a pretty brutal, called him a coward, a lot of things. Anyway, but what he did in that last thing, this is how far a search for self can go. Unconsciously, after that man in the Gold Lamé suit fell apart for him, Phil's unconscious tried something entirely new. That was to create a whole new personality, not to salvage the pieces of the old, but to keep Phil from generally falling apart, create a whole new person. And Phil could weave in and out of being John Train as the situation required it. I mean, it's fascinating. He lasted for about 6 months that way, alienated a lot of friends. Well, pardon me, thought he alienated a lot of friends, did a lot of damage to himself. I think ultimately came out of it realizing that the only way to fix himself was to destroy the body. And this is the interesting thing about suicide that I found out. Most people who commit suicide aren't wanting to die, they're wanting to stop the pain.
Mhm.
They're wanting to stop the fragmentation and the breaking up of the self. And the way you do that is to kill the body. don't mean to be a downer here, but
No, 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 no. I think your observation is spot on. So I I mean that is definitely I mean, yeah, I mean anybody who's been down that road psychologically understands how that manifests, you know. Um and it has very little to do with death and it's very frustrating because suicide scares people a lot.
they should.
It makes Mm.
Okay, let me. That was a quick knee-jerk reaction. I'll explain what I mean in a minute. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. And so, so when someone, it's something hard to admit to, it's hard something to give voice to. Um, and people say, "Oh, you should reach out, you should talk to someone," all this type of thing. And it's kind of like, well, when you see how people react to mentioning it, that also makes you not want to reach out, sort of thing.
Right.
And in autistic and neurodivergent communities, we talk about those types of subjects like the weather sort of thing. And it genuinely kind of freaks people out sort of
Yeah.
thing. And yeah, it is your observations on that are quite true. It has much more to do with whatever psychological pain you're going through rather than, wanting death or jumping into the
Yeah.
void or
And yeah, and the without trying to be cliche here, a couple thoughts. Phil's greatest pursuit, Phil's pursuit of his self was a self that was affirmed. But Phil needed pieces that would allow him to affirm himself. And Phil was never strong enough to affirm himself. And and to understand that no matter how anybody else reacts to what he does, or if his record doesn't sell or whatever, he's still the same person he was or is. Give you a quick example. Phil Ochs also had a close identity with Woody Guthrie, the great Dust Bowl balladeer. And Woody Guthrie is like the father of modern folk music. And Phil had such an understanding of Guthrie's political purposes, vastly better than anybody coming out of Greenwich Village, including Bob Dylan, because Phil believed in the politics. When Guthrie died, and Phil was a well known figure in '67 when Guthrie died, he was excluded from the Guthrie Memorial concert that was put on in favor of more popular people like Judy Collins, Bob Dylan, Richie Havens, people who really didn't necessarily articulate a Guthrie vision. It tore him apart to where in the series of articles, interviews in the what was then called the Broadside magazine, it was a folk music magazine. He talked about how he sat there crying in the audience, torn between anger and rage and feeling rejected, to the point that he said, the people on the stage, he wondered if Woody Guthrie would have been invited to the Woody Guthrie Memorial Service.
yeah.
So he that constant pursuit of affirmation. But here's something too, because if people read the book, it's not a I don't think it's a downer story. Okay, it's a factual story based upon what Phil wanted me to tell. I know that may sound a little odd, but I wrote not what I thought Phil felt or said. I wrote what I believe Phil was telling me to write. Okay. Now, as a songwriter, I also believe I channel a lot of my songs as opposed to writing them. So that's not too far afield. But here's so towards the end of the book, I had to kind of decide, how do I deal with the suicide? How do I deal with the John Train figure? I didn't dwell on him, but and this gets into your comments at the end about suicide, why I went. My comment, for the person who's about to commit suicide, it's not scary. It scares those of us who lost the person because we think there's more we should have done. or what else, whatever. But anyway, what I try to point out to the reader at the end is, we can remember Phil as somebody who committed suicide, who was an alcoholic, who may have been bipolar. Phil had some mental health issues. I'm not convinced he was bipolar, as a lot of people say. But we do him such a great disservice if we remember him mainly for that. Even though, as we celebrate the music, if we remember the person only for those warts, it's a problem. Because those warts and all his struggles in his search for who he was, that also gave us the Phil Ochs that so many people loved, who even at the time or even now, we would not have had such great songs as The War is Over or White Boots Marching Through a Yellow Land. And I know I'm mentioning songs that you millennials aren't familiar with, but if Phil hadn't had, or Pleasures of the Harbor, or so many Chords of
Don't
Fame,
worry, we're all going to go to Spotify or our favorite streaming service and listen to them after.
I sure hope you. I hope you go to your favorite online book retailer and buy the book. Uh, I'm sorry, was that too early to put that shameless self promotion in?
No, no, not at all.
Sorry, I can't do serious for long. I have to throw some levity in. But anyway, to get back on track, we wouldn't have had those songs without a search for self. We wouldn't have had the Phil Ochs who marched in the streets and who tried to organize the anti-war movement without those struggles. We wouldn't have had that person.
Yeah.
So it's like, people
I
learn to
mean,
embrace it and
this is
celebrate
the
it.
Fausti I mean, this is the Faustian bargain you get with so many, you know, great musicians, great artists who come in and do something great, and the place that they have access to create the great thing can also hurt them, also be very damaging to them.
Oh yeah.
Um, and for some people, I think it's a psychological thing. For some people, it can be the lifestyle in terms of, being in the public eye for them is psychologically far too much. You know, um, in a weird way, um, not that it necessarily helped him live any longer, but in a weird way, I wonder, given his fragile emotional state, it's probably better that he wasn't more famous because he probably would have cut it probably a decade off his life, sort of thing. I'm thinking of like Kurt Cobain.
Oh,
You know,
interesting.
Kurt probably would have lived longer if he hadn't been quite as a phenomenon as he was. You
Well,
know,
but
the fame monster comes for people, and how they handle it and how they're able to navigate that depends on how much if they're able to separate themselves from it, still have a life outside of it, be able to function as a human being. And for some people, it absolutely 110% breaks them. I think that's what happened to Britney Spears. When you spend your whole life being famous, she was famous when she was 4 years old. Like when you spend your
right.
whole life and you've never hardly known a day of your life where there has not been people around you, a camera on you, constantly pursue all this type of thing. Whitney Houston said the same thing towards the end of her life. She understood what it was like to be a famous singer. She did not understand what it meant to be an icon. And that is very different. And I think for her, it was a lot too much, you know. And so in a weird, in a weird sort of way, I wonder if that, might have, be careful what you wish for because you just might get it. Um, it's kind of given how he was unable to handle relative obscurity and getting passed over and getting rejected, one kind of wonders how he would have handled the fame monster. Because I think it would
Well,
have ended up at the same coterminous
it,
destination, perhaps one at the speed of a freight train and the other at the speed of a Shenzhen.
yeah, and not too certain how to react, but just again, for those who aren't familiar with Phil Oaks, Phil committed suicide in April of 1976 when he was just 35. So it was a relatively short life. His career, uh, if you're generous, started in 1962. Um, so we're talking 1962. It peaked really well. Peaked. It pretty much was over in 1970 with his last in studio album, Greatest Hits. But I understand what you. But I know it would it had he lived, had he found a way to survive, had he been able to establish some fame, it would be interesting, or gigantic fame like he saw it. I agree with you. It'd be interesting to see how he would have addressed it. Um, I don't. I don't know. I don't know. It could go either way. Um, I know that
It was just an
sometimes.
interesting thought experiment. This is the stuff that
Oh
I
yeah.
think about, sort of
Oh
thing.
no, no. I
Especially when you're talking about how, he dealt with things, psychologically, and how he dealt
okay.
with, the and kind of the broken nature of it all, and how, and kind of how that alternate persona he created towards the end of his life, all that sort of thing.
Well, let
Yeah,
me.
you just kind of wonder,
Okay,
kind of wonder, it's like, oh, what if
but
the opposite had happened? How would that have manifest?
by the way, to play off of what you said, I would do that too, as I was coming to understand Phil and also trying to decide what to put in the book or what or not. But so let me go back and give you an example. I played that game with Phil. Um, oh, you don't mind me using the word game there. I played these thoughts out with Phil too.
Of course, of
I'll go back
course.
to Greatest Hits. The Greatest Hits album is a marvelous album. Every song on that album, except for one that his producer insisted he put on because it was the only protest, is a great song. But Phil also embraced the theater of the absurd. He liked confronting life absurdity with absurdity. Okay. That was part of his whole anti-war approach too, was thus the song, I declare the war is over. The war is over. Anyway, Phil, though, got in his way because no because the parts of who he was not integrated. So you get this album with Phil Ochs in his gold lame suit, red electric guitar, doing a parody on the cover of like Elvis. Okay, if you had taken that, if he could have, if his self was more secure, I'm playing your what if game now. That album had it been called, for example, Chords of Fame, which is one of the songs on, which really touch on the various things you said in your last comments about the dangers of fame and what can happen. It could have been possibly a different result. Had he gone on stage, not in a gold lame suit at the beginning, but as the Phil Ochs people recognized, and then maybe second set come back in and do his parody, a lot of what ifs. But he in this where he was at least, I think, manic at times. The energy Phil put into certain ideas overtook the other parts of who he was. So there was in some ways kind of a lack of discipline. So here, another thing. He wanted to reach the working class. This being the man in the gold lame suit had a political purpose. But what did he do? He went off and he played to his loyal fan base. Okay. He needed their affirmation. He didn't want to risk himself. So he went to the very fans he thought would always be with him. No, you do what a Rick Nelson did when he formed the Stone Canyon Band after being the teen idol. You go play the honky tonks. You become someone's opening act. You go
Yeah.
into the South. You go into these various places where you say you want to reach the people, but to do that, you're putting yourself at a level of risk that I don't think Phil could take. So he ends up failing because he played it safe, and the people he thought would most protect him hurt him.
That's fascinating. That's
Yeah,
fascinating.
I could go on forever, but I know you have limits of how long we can talk.
Well, we are approaching the top of the hour. That is true. No, but this is all so, so fascinating. It's yeah. I I worked for a woman for a little while called Jessie Jacobs who founded the San Jose Museum of Modern Art in California, and she was you know, famous trademark. Um, and she passed in 2020 in the early part of the
Oh,
pandemic. And did the 60s in much the same way, my great aunt, gave Mick Jagger water at Altamont, which just makes me
ooh,
incredibly jealous. Yeah. Um, and uh um and so and has done all this type of thing. And so I'm always fascinated um with that period of history and some of the people and the names that you do know and the names that you don't know. And much like how my art mentor has passed, we're losing that generation of people
yeah.
who did that. And um,
Well,
and it's kind of funny that it gets associated with the boomers, even though most of them didn't do the 60s. They were too young. It was the silent generation who really did the
right,
60s.
right, exactly.
Well, you had to have been born before or during the war to really engage in a lot of those things.
Yep,
You know, and so it's a very fascinating period in time, and one of the things I love is finding something like this and someone who's an expert and talking
yeah.
about it. These are the
Well,
days when I love what I do. So this has
yeah.
been very good.
Okay, if I could, and again, I don't want to go over, but if I could end on something, what I think is very positive.
Yeah.
One of the great things about doing this book is even though much of it is Phil's own words, I did reach out to some people. All these years later, the impact that Phil had on people's lives, particularly friends, Phil didn't understand how much he was loved. Let me give you one quick example. The legendary Tom Paxton, another folk singer from that era. When I reached him through his people and he wrote me back, I asked him if he would do an interview with me. Quote, and this was the answer he gave me: anything for Phil.
Yeah.
That, you know, the stories of people like Tom Paxton, Larry Ratso Sloman, who's a journalist who's also well known for his book on the Rolling Thunder Review. Older friends of Phil's, Lee Housekeeper, who was a music PR person. Their memories of Phil are so wonderful, and they still to this day carry a sense of loss. Phil was loved. Phil didn't know how much he was loved.
Yes, I understand that at a very great level. I think many of my friends would say that of myself as well. So I get that at a very deep level, which is why I say to bring the conversation full circle. Oh, if you don't have whatever that thing is inside you that gives you, call it self-worth, self-love, self-respect, self-affirmation, whatever have you, I don't think you can't retrieve it later. And I've had arguments with therapists about this, and I'm kind of like, no, I think that's one of those things in life. Either you have it or you don't. It's like talent. Either you have it or you don't. And if you don't have it, you can't retrieve it again. You have to learn to live without it.
Here's where I won't disagree with you. I'll just challenge you and change it a little bit. No, you got to keep searching for it because it's in you somewhere. You just haven't found it. Now, and when I say you, I'm not talking about you particular, but the person just hasn't found it yet. And that was part of Phil's great struggle. He could never find it.
Yeah, I mean that's
You
what I
can
said.
have
It's
me
kind
back
of
when you talk about a whole other topic if you want.
no, no, I mean that's why I said I think I think it's sad that he didn't kind of survive to get into the 80s when he could have been meditating on a beach in
Yeah.
Malibu and and doing the whole thing that so many other, people of that period did when they kind of said, we can't change the world, so we're going to change ourselves.
Yeah.
Um,
And
and
I don't have a
there's a really great British filmmaker named Adam Curtis who has a whole film about how the failure of the anti-war movement led to the narcissism of the boomers and all this sort of thing. And I could totally see, knowing, having had this conversation, if he'd lived 4 or 5 more years, he would, would have been a vegan restaurant proprietor in, Malibu, meditating and doing yoga. I totally see it. Um,
Oh,
and
when I share this podcast on some of the Phil Ochs sites and other, I'm going to love to see how some of the folks react to your comments.
well, they're welcome to, please remind them to please keep the pillories and pitchforks to themselves. Please put out your torches. It's not necessary. I'm just a guy. Um, but yeah, I could totally
Sorry.
see, no, no, but I think that's, but no, but I think that's how a lot of people ended up doing it. And it was that whole, and I think, there's, I mean, a lot of, it's like Jane Fonda talks about how much her father hated fame. Henry Fonda hated being famous and how incredibly distant she was and how much different than that she wanted to be. I think that the same thing that plagued Phil Ochs manifests itself in different people in a lot of different ways.
And I
And
think and sorry.
yeah, and that's why I say, like, I think if he lived a few more years, he probably would have ended up going in that direction just because that was the popular thing to do, and he might have found something along the way. Unfortunately, he just didn't make it that long to get to the next place where he would have someone would come along with the book, the expert, the resources to be able to learn how to
Yeah,
live with yourself, find that thing within yourself that makes things more manageable, all this
right.
type of thing,
And ultimately, yes, the sad reality for Phil was the at the end the level of pain was just too great. The pain in himself. I personally, based upon what I feel he revealed to me, I actually think Phil's self died in in the early 19 in the early part of 1970 when his last album and his music was rejected.
Yeah.
By the time he committed suicide, the self in many ways was already dead, and he was finally just killing off the pain of that and the grief of never finding his self. But you are also correct, and I'll end with this because I realize we are going longer now, and I appreciate it. Um, Phil's search for his own self is his story, but it's a story that we all have in our own way too. We're all searching for who we are. I do believe
Yes.
that.
No, I would agree with you. I think everybody has to go figure that out for themselves. And I think, I think it's easier if you have a functional, supportive family. No families are perfect, but if it's good enough, as my Nana would put it, good enough family situation, then
Yes,
you can kind of find a space for that. I think a lot of people use their family, their town, their culture, the world they grew up in as a way to kind of define that for them and themselves, and it gives them a guide. Um, I think and I say this of myself, one of the greatest curses in life is to look at the world and want a lot and holding your hand out to the world and asking for a lot. When you have that thing inside you where it's like you were meant for more and you want to do, this big thing or the dream is so big or whatever have you, it's really a terrible burden.
yeah.
And I say that because I look at my, friends who are, VP of this and director of that and all this
Mm-hmm.
type of thing. And they have, wives and children and personal lives and they go on vacations and all this type of thing. Um, and, that's not the path that I went down. That's not a path a lot of people went down. And I think that ends up being kind of a terrible a terrible burden to bear. And then I think to have, to have it unfulfilled becomes incredibly psychologically damaging as well. It's a really terrible thing. So I think the journey can lead to different destinations, for
Yeah.
different people depending on who
Okay.
they are, is what I'm trying to say very
Yeah.
badly.
Well, and by the way, again, I keep trying to say this was the last thing. You said something. I liked your phrase that your grandmother used to say, "Good enough," because even if your family's good enough, you may feel you belong at least at some level. And so a part of that search for self that we have, and Phil had it too, was that search for belonging. So whether it was when he was at military academy, where he actually felt that he fit in quite well, when it was trying to be a journalist at Ohio State, you know, he found places, Greenwich Village, why he felt so rejected of the Woody Guthrie. He felt that that community that he wanted to be so much a part of, to be, belonging to, he felt rejected. The war movement, he wanted to be belonging. He was one of the original founders of the Yippies. He wanted to feel like he belonged to something. A good portion of our search for self is about also feeling like we belong. The big question always is, can we ever get to the point, do we ever get to the point where we feel we belong to ourself?
Oh.
Whoa. How's that for a deep thought? I'm not doing
Oh
nonsense, something
God,
else
that's
after
my
that.
after no, that's my afternoon buggard.
But
Oh,
I'm
I
not
need
I'm not
to.
saying another word other than thank you for this time.
Oh, that's my afternoon done. I will be spending the rest of the day thinking about that, which is very sad. I have a million things to do. That's going to be bumping around in my brain for a while.
Okay, well, I'm done.
Oh, no, thank you. Why don't
Oh,
you tell us where we can buy the book and where we can
one
find you
more time.
online? Yes.
That Man in the Gold Lamé Suit, Phil Ochs' Search for Self, available on all of your major online retailers like Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, Thrift Books. Also can be ordered from your independent bookstore if you prefer to do that. So pretty much, if you just Google the title, or you'll find it. It's
Awesome.
everywhere.
Well, thank you so much, Jim. Thank you for coming on the Cameron Journal podcast.
Oh, thank you for having me, Cameron. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
That's all for this episode of the Cameron Journal podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Visit us online at CameronJournal.com. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and I love to talk to my followers and listeners, so please feel free to get us on social media at Cameron Cowan on Twitter, and we'll see you next time on the Cameron Journal podcast.